whistles, everything. Thank you. I'll wait until afterwards to see if it's actually an excellent presentation, but thank you, Joshua. So my name's Andi Mann. I'm the Chief Technology Advocate for Splunk. That is the only shameless plug I shall give today, maybe on the last slide. Let's see. My Twitter handle is there. If you want to tweet at me or about me, go ahead. And if you want to email me about some of the details later on, my email address is also there. No gatekeepers, it's all me. If anyone answers, it's me. So thanks for coming along. I'm going to dive in, but first, I work for a public company in the US, so I need to spend the next 15 minutes reading this aloud to you. I'm not going to do that, but please have a look at it. What it really means is we're a publicly traded company. If I talk about futures, future product, future directions, anything like that, please confirm on our website and on the SEC's website. So, with the formalities done, let's get into the State of DevOps Report. So, the State of DevOps Report, the original gangster DevOps research. We are now in its 7th year. We've just released the State of DevOps Report for 2019. I'll touch on some of that a little bit later, but let's dive into 2018. The State of DevOps Report is the world's largest body of DevOps knowledge. We've been running this report with Puppet Labs since, I think, 2013. Quite some time. The authors change occasionally, but a couple of people have been constant. Alana Brown, who runs product marketing there at Puppet. She's a tour de force of the research biz. Nigel Kirsten, he is one of the founders and the VP of engineering over there at Puppet. I worked on this year's report and last year's report and the one before. I actually worked on the very first one for about 10 minutes. And Michael Stanke is now at Circle CI. So just in terms of the demos, global survey. So we actually made a real effort this year to get more responses from Asia and Oceania. You can see a reasonable balance of North America, Europe, and Asia with a couple of others thrown into the mix. 3,000 plus respondents. If you have other people who are interested in this in other languages, we have translated into a couple. If there are others you need, let me know. In terms of the roles, departments, the teams, you know, it's interesting. We got mostly in individual contributor roles. So programmers, developers, engineers, operators, but we had a good chunk of management as well, and even executives. So that gave us some interesting insights. Mostly IT and development or engineering, a little bit of security, mostly IT ops and DevOps type of teams. In terms of the size of companies we got responses from, you know, all over the map, mostly, you know, 2 billion or more is a longer number because it's a unbounded set, but it's pretty even across the board. So, that's the demographics. I just want to give you an understanding of how we got the data. Let's have a look at some of the key findings. The real finding is this. DevOps is non-linear. So we see a lot of maturity curves and organizational charts and stuff which say how you should do the DevOps. You start here, then you do this, then you do this, then you do this. That's true to an extent, but what we really found was that people pick and choose the right things for them to do when they need to. And so we saw, you know, we actually categorized 5 stages of this evolution, but then we found out about this non-linear. So it's not just a straight line. We saw that organizations start with normalizing their tech stack. Standardization makes things easier to manage, easier to automate. We then saw that they standardize and reduce variability. And so variability around tests, around releases, variability in monitoring tools and technologies. We see then the third stage, expanding those practices. So typically starting in a small group and then moving and expanding those practices amongst multiple teams. In stage 4, we see a lot of more automation, especially around infrastructure. Hard to automate provisioning, configuration, rollout and rollback, etc., when your processes are not standardized to start with. So that's why this seems to come fairly late in the process. And then providing self-service. This is one of the big indicators towards DevOps success, is allowing other teams to self-serve using your knowledge. So as an IT operations person, for example, standardizing provisioning and configuration so that development teams can self-serve and put servers out there in the cloud or even on premises by themselves, for example. But you'll also see this is not a 1, 2, 3 across a linear phase. Some of this actually happens early, some late. This is generally what people seem to do. So we identified these 5 stages. But then we had a look at some other practices and realized there was actually a stage 0. There was a foundational stage where the survey respondents performed certain kinds of activities and actions and then continued to improve on those throughout their evolution. So even when they were going through stages 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 in this chart, they were also continuing to build their stage 0 and building that foundation. So that's what I want to talk to you about today, is about that foundation. I'm not going to go into all of the details of the 5 different stages. I'm just going to go into the 5 areas we looked at in the foundational phase. So firstly, and I'll go into these in a little bit more detail, monitoring and alerting are configurable by the team operating the service. So this is pretty straightforward when you think about it. If you're an IT ops, then you configure your own monitoring. If you're a developer running your own code, you configure your own monitoring. This sort of makes sense. I'll go into a little bit more detail in a moment on all of these. Reusing deployment patterns for building applications or services. So this comes back into the idea of automating infrastructure, automating release, automating testing, reusing the patterns for building and delivering applications and services. Third key area there was reusing testing patterns. So when you do testing and quality assurance, not doing one-off testing every time, standardizing that practice and that process so you're reusing those same testing patterns. You'll notice this word come up a lot, reuse. It's about efficiency and productivity. If you're able to standardize such that you can reuse those standard processes over and over, you get faster, you get better, you get more efficient. Fourth area, teams contribute improvements to tooling provided by other teams. This is really interesting when you think about DevOps at its core about collaboration, communication, integration between different teams to deliver software faster. Then when you think about this, contributing improvements, telling other teams how they can do their work better, makes sense. And the final area in this foundational phase is this idea of managing configurations with configuration management tooling. Now here's where I want to point out a little bit of survey bias. This was run by a company that does configuration management tooling. So take that with as much grains of salt as you'd like, but I still stand behind the research. So let's dive in a little bit deeper in each of these areas. So firstly, monitoring and alerting are configurable by the team operating the service. So when we looked at this research, we found that organizations that did this were 24 times more organizations that were at the top of the maturity curve. And this is how we segregated this out, by the way. We looked at efficiency, we looked at delivery time, we looked at the ability to deliver, not necessarily how often you deliver. We looked at stability in the production. We looked at some business numbers. We looked at things like revenue, revenue increase, and we used all of those to categorize the respondents into these 3 different sets, low, medium, and high maturity. So what we found was, in the high maturity set, so these are the people who are doing DevOps well, right? They've got faster release times, they can release more often, they have less instability in production, so they're getting out with good results. They were 24 times more likely to always enable configuration of monitoring and alerting for their own team. So the service, the team operating the service is able to do that. This to me talks to the idea of a single source of truth. When you're looking at the monitoring capabilities, if you've got multiple teams looking at different consoles and using different tooling, or maybe just using different thresholds, or maybe just different alerts, then all of a sudden you've got a disconnect. This is not a collaborative environment. This is where you start pointing fingers at each other, going, my console says everything's good, it must be your fault. That's not DevOps, right? DevOps is our console says there's a problem, let's work together and fix it. And so by configuring, monitoring, and alerting yourself, to start with, you're collaborating better. Secondly, it means that the application development and engineering teams are able to use their expertise and knowledge to help define what a good service looks like. So when you get that service, not over the wall anymore, where we're all doing it together, you get that service, you're able to figure out, is that threshold realistic? With your development team working with the operations team together, yes, because they're configuring it themselves. It also means, thirdly, when you're doing triage and troubleshooting, you understand what you're looking at. So for an organization where application developers throw the code over the wall to operations who then configure their own monitoring, when you do that on-call support, the development team doesn't know what they're looking at. They didn't make that console, they didn't make those alerts, they didn't make those thresholds, so they're lost. So having this capability where the people who build the code don't just run the code, but also tell you what it looks like when it's running well, and what it means when it's running badly. You can get much, much better outcomes in the survey data, 24x better than maybe you were before. Staying on stage 0, remember, these are foundational steps. They continue to evolve over the course of the life cycle of their DevOps practice, but these are stuff that starts early and continues on. And the second one is reusing deployment patterns for building applications and services. So in this, we found that the high maturity group, the high outcome group, were 23 times more likely to be doing this. Oh, by the way, I'm not going to go into the box charts. You can see that there's variance. You can see that, for example, in this case, 46% of the high performers always do this. We're down to, 1% rarely do it, right? So you can read that box if you wish. These slides will be available to download after the event. But I'm going to focus on the big picture number. So we asked, how frequently were these practices used after you started to see traction with DevOps? And we saw that we reuse deployment patterns. So what that means is I have a standardized method of rolling out new products and services. If I have new software, even if I'm in a multi-team environment, we all use the same capability or process. Someone who knows what it is about sets it up, maybe continue to tweak it and refine it, but you don't do a new thing every time. Again, standardizing and reusing processes and tools and capabilities, and in a lot of cases people and skills, is just a lot more efficient and effective way to deliver software. In the third foundational practice, reusing testing patterns for building applications or services. Again, we asked, so the specific question was, do you reuse testing patterns for building applications or services? How frequently did you do that after you started seeing traction with DevOps? This one was really significant. Well, it's all significant, statistically speaking. I'm not a statistician, but we had a researcher who knows this stuff who helped us. 44 times more likely to use this practice in the high-performing group. That's phenomenal. So what this means is reusing testing tools and patterns and capabilities. So for unit test, for functional test, for smoke test, again, if you standardize this capability in this pattern, then you end up seeing more outcomes. The other part about standardization and reusing testing patterns, this is part of the feedback loop. So when we talk about DevOps, you talk about Gene Kim's 3 key areas of DevOps, and we get to this cycle of continuous learning, right? Which is only possible if you close that feedback loop. So when there are problems happening in production, and I use when because they always happen, you understand what you need to test for next time. That's a classic part of the feedback loop. So having IT ops and sysadmins, SREs, data center people, whatever you want to call them, being able to feed into the backlog, this is very much an SRE kind of practice, where instead of just opening a ticket and then hoping someone fixes it. You actually diagnose the problem and you put it into backlog. Hopefully you fix it, but you also add a test into your testing routines and patterns so that that problem that we've discovered in production, we never see again. Or at least we only see it during testing and QA cycles. So you then get to reuse this over and over. Not just within the same team, by the way, but also sharing that with other teams. And the second last area around configuration management. So in this, we're back to 27x. Gee, only 27 times more likely to be using this, not 44. But this is pretty significant as well, right? So again, those companies, those businesses that were in the high-performing set were 27 times more likely to use a configuration management tool to manage their configurations. Now, if you've been around DevOps for a little while, this is pretty straightforward. You know, we sort of started thinking about DevOps in the configuration as code mentality. So we looked at Chef today as a partner and a sponsor here at code-conf. Chef was one of the earliest configuration as code vendors and very much set the stage for what DevOps is and brought the automation part of CAMs, culture, automation, measurement, sharing. Some people put lean in the middle of that, calms. Chef really sort of started that automation, that infrastructure as code. Puppet as well, by the way, simultaneous kind of appearances on the stage. Again, please take this with whatever grains of salt you would like. A survey run by a configuration management company, you have to wonder about the results a little bit. But, we didn't pressure anyone. We didn't select the sample audience. We tried to avoid bias in all sorts of ways by looking for different audiences and so forth. So, I stand behind the validity of the research, but understand that where it's coming from. But 27 times more likely to use configuration management. Again, this is about repeatability, productivity, standardization, automation, a lot of the things that we know and love in the DevOps world. The final one I found, just one other thing here. This is something we touched on in the report generally and quite broadly. When you think about where to start applying some of these practices, these known good practices, this is one of the many examples in the report that show you it's at the boundary. So the boundaries between teams become where code and operations can fall apart. So if you hand off code as an engineer to a testing team, then if they don't know what's going on, if they're not part of your group, if they're not collaborating and communicating, then they won't know what to test. They'll run some standard tests. Maybe they'll reuse their testing, which is good, as we've seen, but they don't really know. It's a boundary issue. This boundary issue is at dev to ops. So this is a release time boundary. Again, things slip through the cracks when you've got these boundary conditions. And so having a configuration management tool, just like having other automation tooling, release automation, test automation, make sure that, it helps to make sure that that boundary condition is covered. Development and operations work together on a configuration that they know is good for that application. And then they reuse that configuration until they realize they have to change it for some reason. Then they work together and change it. So that boundary never really exists. So there's a lot in the report that touches on that. Again, I'm just going through stage hero. There's 5 more stages in the report that we talk about in quite some depth. A lot of activity at the boundary is causing problems in DevOps. And we see the high performers using tools and techniques to smooth the transition between teams and across those boundary marks. The last one speaks directly to that. And this for me was something really impactful. What we saw was high performers are around 44 times more likely to contribute to other teams' tools. This is a great sign of collaboration. This is what DevOps should be about. So again, when you read these data points, it seems obvious. But it's nice to have the data to back up what we believe is true. So in this case, what we see is, for example, developers helping IT operations to build monitoring. We see cloud monitoring specialists helping on-premises teams to build alerting for their systems. We see operations contributing to testing tools and testing routines and procedures. So all sorts of different teams are able to contribute to other teams' toolings across all of these different situations. And this, for me, really does speak to the heart of DevOps. This is about teams working together, collaborating, but with purpose to make release better, configuration better, monitoring better, alerting better. Interesting article yesterday or day before yesterday from Redmonk, analyst firm out of the UK. Some of you may know people like James Governor, talking about how, yes, culture can be created by tooling. If you're required to use the same tool as someone else, you'll end up working better with them. Now, culture is a very complex thing. Changing the culture of an organization to be collaboration and communication together doesn't happen easily. Culture is an output, not an input. Culture is a result of things that you do and say. And if one of the things you do is share and collaborate on how tools work, and then use the same tools together, it brings you together. I'm not saying that gives you a perfect DevOps culture, but yes, you can start to transform your culture by implementing certain types of tools and practices. And this is one example of that. This all plays into this singular finding. I think we all knew this, right? It's 10 years since DevOps, and the first definition of DevOps was communication and collaboration and integration between Dev and Ops. So obviously, cross-team sharing is the foundation. But again, it's good to have the evidence, the data. What I see here is that at a low level of evolution, there's some sharing, but it's sort of inside the team, just within one team. So just in Ops, just in QA, just in Dev. Oh, by the way, I'll mention other teams apart from Dev and Ops quite a lot, because I believe that DevOps doesn't start with Dev and it doesn't end with Ops. Some of you will have other orgs, PMO, security, QA, test, release management, a bunch of other teams. So the bigger your organization, the worse this problem gets, because at the low level of maturity, it's just amongst your team. If you have a full stack team, then maybe everything's good, because you're sharing amongst the whole team that matters. But if you have these separate teams, then you've got to think about how do you share across those team boundaries. So it's not just process boundaries, but obviously team boundaries as well. And all the way up to the higher level, at third up, sharing across the organization. This is where you see a very strong evolution from 12% to 22% to 33% of organizations sharing outside my team. In fact, not just beyond teams, but even to different departments. What we don't see a lot of yet is at the very top layer there. Sharing patterns, processes, tooling outside your business or company or organization. Now, that's, of course, what we're doing here today, and we'll have a panel where we share even more. But typically that doesn't happen when you go back to work. So maybe this is where you can start to think about joining a community of practice, getting on a Slack group. I'm personally on the all-day DevOps group, for example. There's something like 40,000 people on that Slack channel. These are all the people who have presented and listened to the all-day DevOps virtual conference that is, by the way, happening next week again. I think something like 60,000 people have signed up for it now. But think about maybe sharing your known good practices by joining an organization, a chat group, coming to conferences like this, again, and sharing that knowledge. Because we believe that that is an indicator for success, but the data doesn't back it up with any statistical significance because not enough people are even doing it to be able to judge whether it's good or not. So, they are the 5 foundational stages. That's stage 0, the 5 practices in stage 0. I'll touch on briefly, and I'm not going to go through these slides. They're very wordy, but again, I've included them so you can download them later. These are the other 5 stages. So firstly, normalizing the technology stack. So I talked a little bit about this, but the specific practices using version control with your application development and using a standard operating system environment are defining practices in this stage. Contributors to success, building on those platforms, using version control for your configurations, not just your code, testing infrastructure changes before going into prod, as well as testing application changes, and allowing that source code to be shared amongst teams. So I've read out that whole slide. I'm not going to do that with the rest of them. I would encourage you to have a look at the report. There are links at the end of this presentation. You can download it. Stage 2 is about, as I said before, standardizing and reducing variability. And by the way, part of the goal of the State of DevOps reports is to give you practical, actionable advice to go away and try some stuff out and see if you can get better as well. And so the actual practices, deploying on a single operating system again, building on those standard technologies, and then reusing deployment patterns. We've talked about that already. Re-architecting applications based on business need. So not lift and shift to the cloud, for example. Refactor, rebuild, take advantage of the infrastructure and the capabilities that you've got. Don't just assume you're going to get the benefits. Expanding DevOps practices in stage 3. It makes sense that after you've gone through a couple of phases, you want to share that knowledge and get better across multiple teams and different groups. And so sharing the knowledge, letting individuals do the work without manual approvals because you've standardized already, you've encoded in automation routines, so no one needs to approve it because if they have access to automation, they have access to a known good practice that someone else has defined. Again, reusing these patterns is a very, very strong indicator to success in this mode. Automating infrastructure delivery. Again, I don't want to say too much about this. Provisioning, configuration. Infrastructure and configuration is one of the biggest problem elements in our world. You will see massive outages just from configuration problems. So, for example, I believe Equinix blamed, Equifax, the credit rating agency, I think they blamed a configuration change or a lack of configuration change on their massive data breach. 150 million American names, social security numbers, all sorts of stuff leaked. And I'm pretty sure that they blamed that on a configuration change that wasn't implemented. Ultimately blaming one person for not doing that, which is entirely unfair in a complex system. We can talk about that later. Talk to J. Paul Reed about some of these ideas around systems thinking and root cause analysis and why we're all wrong about that. But importantly, automating that infrastructure lets you get repeatability. Repeatability gives you speed as well, and it reduces errors. Oh, by the way, automation also has a security component because automation has an audit trail, so you know who's doing what. You can allow the automation to get access to anything as long as that's the right thing, and that means that the automation can do the job. The people are segregated, so we start to think about segregation of duties, so we're talking about compliance benefits as well. I come from an automation background. That's my jam, so I'm extremely excited about the idea that automation is a high maturity option for DevOps. And finally, providing self-service. This is how you spread that knowledge across the organization, even potentially outside the organization, but certainly within your organization, being able to give other people access to your automation routines or getting access to other people's automation routines when they're the experts and they built that up and it's working. Why would you not? Why would you rewrite it yourself? So using that knowledge, sharing across those boundaries of teams and processes, smoothing out the delivery cycle, managing incidents with automated responses, deploying resources, cloud systems, servers, jar files, whatever you need, using automation, self-serve. This is very cloudy, right? So again, very clear why this would contribute to DevOps success, because this is really about collaboration and automation and Both of those are core parts of CAMS. Okay, I've got about 13 minutes, so I'm going to go for my bonus round. I didn't know if I'd make this or not. Not advertised, but I'll give you a sneak peek of what we just released. Literally, this report was released, I think, 2 weeks ago. This is the 2019 version of the State of DevOps Report. This year, we looked a lot at security. And I said, DevOps doesn't start with dev and doesn't end with ops, because there's also, amongst many other teams, security. So I'm not going to go through the whole report. This is just a bonus round. Surprise, 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 DevOps improves security. Now, this actually makes a whole lot of sense, but we needed to research it to know the truth. So what we did is we looked at the different phases of software development, and we broke it down into 5. It's very rudimentary: requirement gathering, design, build, test, deploy. And deployment includes run, and I have a bit of an issue because ops is an important part of DevOps, and we only went to deployment here, so software development doesn't stop at deployment, as we all know, because you've got to operate it. So we got a pretty good sample, a bell curve of different people at different levels of that software delivery, and we looked at the type of integration of security teams. Did they integrate in requirements gathering? Did they work with security on testing or building an application? Or did they work only with security at the end? Or across all phases? So that's how we tried to figure out who's doing it better and what are they doing. So the key finding is, again, it's about the boundaries between teams. Cross-team collaboration builds confidence in security. Now, that's a very deliberate phrase. We don't know if they're more secure or not. We can just ask if they think they are secure. So in our research, we didn't go out and look at how many breaches did you have, how many data leakages did you have, how many people got in through your firewall that shouldn't have. There's an almost infinite number of questions you could ask, and there's probably infinity minus one that will never get answered in a survey. It's really hard to find this. So what we looked for instead as a proxy for being secure was feeling confident that you're secure. There's not a direct match there. So again, take that with the grains of salt that you might need. But we thought it was a useful heuristic, given that we couldn't really find out if people were secure. So what we saw was, not surprising, the more mature your DevOps is, the more secure you are, the more confident in your security you are. So organizations feel that as their processes and policies get more integrated into each phase of the development and delivery lifecycle, they feel like their systems are more secure. That's good. That makes sense. Quick word about deployment frequency, by the way. This is from the 2019 report, but I think it actually applies more to the 2018 report. Just because you can deploy doesn't mean you should or will. This chart, it's not that easy to read, and I'm sorry about that, but you can get this chart from the slides when you download them. But essentially what it's saying is that as teams get more and more mature with their DevOps practices, they are able to deliver faster, and that's a pretty good metric, but actually delivering faster is not a good metric. Because in a lot of organizations, especially as we see DevOps expand into bigger organizations that are more complex and less technological, we see that deploying frequently can cause problems rather than benefits. One example I see very often in my world is training. I deploy a new screen, and all of a sudden, that's a new screen in front of 10,000 people who work in a front office, in a bank branch, in an insurance agent, in a retail store. All of a sudden, I've got 10,000 people who can't find the button. If anyone here who here has done user acceptance testing as part of their job? So users, a lot of our users, they don't know when you change things. They don't know to look in other places. You can completely destroy their workflow. You go to a bank branch the day after you've released new software and go and watch the people in the front office trying to find out what's going on. Listen to them. They'll tell you, oh, our computer system changed last night. I can't find anything. Sorry, I'm slow. Right? This is a customer service issue. So deployment frequency, not necessarily a great metric. Ability to deploy, Much better metric. So, the top 5 security practices that will improve confidence. Again, the State of DevOps report is aimed at trying to find what you can actually do to achieve some of these results. There's a lot of research that says DevOps is good, right? That's great. That's amongst the reasons you're here. We try and tell you how to make yourself good. So 5 practices here that we isolated. Security and development teams collaborate on threat models. So again, this is something you can go back to your workplace tomorrow. Go seek out your security teams. If there's anyone from security here, go seek out your DevOps teams. Go do this. Figure out what threats are you facing. Work together to figure out how to detect and prevent them. Second one, security tools are integrated into the pipeline. So security testing, pen testing, for example, is part of your development lifecycle process. And everyone is responsible for security in that mode. Third, security requirements are prioritized as part of backlog. So we all put features into backlog. If you're in the SRE mode, the Site Reliability Engineering mode, if you don't know a lot about that, have a look at the book, Site Reliability Engineering. It's O'Reilly. It was written by the great engineers at Google. One of the things that they do in the SRE book, in that world, is technical failures can go into backlog. So system administrators, IT operators, site reliability engineers, whatever you would call them, when they identify problems, they can go and put that solution into backlog. Again, it's not just opening a ticket. Opening a ticket never solved a problem. Doing work solved problems. So this is an extension of that. We see that high security posture is correlated with the ability to put security requirements into backlog and prioritize them. I mean, putting stuff into backlog's easy. Anyone can do that. Making sure it gets worked on, that's the hard thing. So that's one of the big differentiators that we found in this research. Infrastructure-related security policies are reviewed before deployment. It's not just that IT ops go and define a known good configuration and then put that into a configuration management tool and then off you go. In high-performing organizations that have high confidence in their security, you actually get security teams to review configurations before you enact them and deploy them. And the final action you can actually take tomorrow, go and work with your security teams on tests. Get them to help evaluate your testing, and they'll maybe find some potential problems, things you're not looking for. Everyone's looking for SQL injections, but your security people are experts in zero-day and modern threats. They will know a lot more about what is happening in the environment and where your threats are coming from. Get them to help you as you set up your testing. So, just to reiterate, our key finding is that doing DevOps well enables you to also do security well. So, that's about all I have. For more of this, please check out the new 2019 State of DevOps Report. Of course, please also download the 2018 State of DevOps Report. And you can actually get the 5 foundational practices of DevOps separately as an individual take-home. So you can download all of these. I'm going to leave this slide here for a moment, just in case you wanted to take notes or take pictures or what have you. This deck will be available for download later on, so you don't need to take notes. Oh, hang on, this is my summary. I'm seeing the wrong slide here. Yes, this is the things I just said. What I really was talking about was this slide. So this is my last shameless plug. You can get the State of DevOps reports from the Puppet website, but they're not here and I am. So I'd love for you to go and get the State of DevOps reports from the Splunk website instead, and then I can show my boss my downloads and hit my MBOs. Couple of additional things there. Couple of white papers. Please do go to our website, splunk.com/devops. Bunch of stuff on that. And yeah, there's even the 2017 State of DevOps report, as well as a whole bunch of others. There's still a couple of cameras up. Again, you can download this when you download the whole deck. So with that, I'm going to hang around. We're going to set up stations for the panel that's coming up. I hope you've got some good questions in. I'm on the panel, a bunch of other speakers. With that, I'll say thank you. And while everyone's setting up, maybe I could take some questions?
Stuff, perhaps.